Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your story. On my 11th birthday, I went to school that day, and at the end of the day, I was walking out of the school building. I was carrying a box of leftover Dunkin' Donuts munchkins that I had brought to share with my classmates for my birthday. And everyone, all the kids and teachers, they were headed out of the building. Kids were headed to their buses. I was wearing my backpack, holding this box of munchkins, and I tripped and fell flat on my face on the front school steps. Right there, in front of everyone. The munchkins went flying in all different directions, and I was on the ground. In my memory, it all happened in torturous slow motion. You know how that is? And from the ground, I could see a teacher coming up to me to see if I needed help, to ask if I was okay, and before she could get to me, I jumped up, I gathered my mangled munchkin box, and I said, "I'm good," and I hauled up to my bus. And then on the bus, I sat next to a window, and I could feel myself start to cry. I turned my face toward the window so that others on the bus couldn't see the tears, and I willed those tears away. It was almost, thank you, Dan. It was almost like these tears were sucked back into my face at that moment. That's how strong my will was. How's this sound? Is it good? Thanks. See, I was sitting there on the bus, and I was just so worried that the other kids would see me crying. When I was a kid, I was terrified, mortified by the idea that someone outside of my family might see me crying. I would get so embarrassed. And then I would cry more because I was so embarrassed, and then that would make me more embarrassed, and then it was a whole vicious cycle. And on this day, I held my tears in through the bus ride, just barely. At my stop, I booked it home, threw myself into my parents' arms, sobbed, telling them the whole story. How lucky I feel that they were a safe place for me to let it all out. Flash forward about 13 years. I'm in my early 20s at work at a nonprofit office job, probably about 23. I'd just gone to use the bathroom, and when I come out of the stall, I find one of my coworkers, who I don't really know that well, there in the bathroom alone, crying. I freeze. For a second, our eyes lock. And not knowing what to do, I just blurt out, "I'm sorry," and I run out of the bathroom and back to my desk. I don't even remember if I stopped to wash my hands. You see, there in that bathroom, I projected my own childhood embarrassment over my tears onto my coworker. I figured the best thing that I could do for a crying person who I didn't know all that well was to give them space and pretend it never happened. And also, perhaps I just didn't feel confident in my own ability to be helpful to someone else who was in distress. I didn't know how to let someone hold my tears with me. And so I didn't know how to hold someone else's tears with them. My own discomfort with vulnerability had made me super uncomfortable with someone else's vulnerability too. Oh, how I could have benefited from learning the simple skills of that rabbit from our story today, right? That skill of offering a gentle presence and deep listening. So much of what we learned in seminary about pastoral care could be taught just with that one simple story. months after the bathroom incident, after I'd gotten to know that coworker better, I apologized to her. Remember that time I found you crying in the bathroom? I shared with her all that had been going through my head, and we laughed a little. We swapped awkward crying stories, including the great birthday munchkin fall of 5th grade. And she shared with me what it was that day that had caused those tears for her. In this mutual sharing, her and I grew just a little bit closer. And we were able to recognize ourselves in each other and through each other. Together, we were able to soften into these vulnerable corners of our lives. Right now, Christians are in the season of Lent. It's the time of year in the Christian liturgical calendar that starts with Ash Wednesday and then leads up to Good Friday and Easter, which traditionally observe the death and subsequent resurrection of Jesus. Lent is a season that invites reflection on our own mortality and our own limitations. It's a reminder that humans are inherently vulnerable creatures. All of us. None of us is alone in our vulnerability. None of us is alone in our vulnerability. We hear more and more these days about the value of leaning in to vulnerability, don't we? Especially if you, like me, follow the popular work of social researcher and storyteller Brene Brown, who has consistently found in her research that being vulnerable is crucial for building meaningful connection. That vulnerability is, quote, the cradle of emotions and experiences that we crave. Brene Brown says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. And when we're talking about vulnerability here, we're not just talking about sharing our tears and our traumas and our deeply held secrets. Psychologist and friendship expert, Dr. Marissa Franco, defines vulnerability in a social emotional context as sharing the true parts of myself that I fear might result in my rejection or alienation. Sharing the true parts of myself that I feared might result in my rejection or alienation. That's going to look a little bit different for different people, isn't it? Earlier, we heard Ken so beautifully share a bit about what has felt vulnerable to him. These true parts of himself that have felt risky to share. What is it that feels vulnerable to you? What is it? Perhaps it's the idea of sharing about certain feelings that you have bubbling up inside of you. Perhaps it's just the idea of asking for help or expressing what you want, sharing what you think or believe, putting yourself out there to make friends, admitting when you got something wrong, setting boundaries in a relationship. That can feel very vulnerable. Maybe it's letting someone take care of you. Maybe it's letting someone see you struggle. Maybe it's saying, I love you. Maybe it's simply relaxing your muscles in your body and letting your guard down a little. It's not even always that easy to recognize what feels truly vulnerable, is it? It's not. Sometimes to uncover it, we have to peek underneath our defense mechanisms. We all have them. We have to drill deeper into those moments when we find ourselves on autopilot, reacting to a situation with walls or armor or avoidance or control or anger or self-deprecation or a performance of some kind. These strategies that we've adapted to protect ourselves. What's under there? What is it that feels vulnerable to you? What true parts of yourself do you fear might result in rejection or alienation? What feels risky to put out there? Is there any way you can let yourself soften into those corners of your heart just a little bit more? When one of my minister mentors, Reverend Christina Leon Tracy, when she talks about vulnerability, she gives the example of pill bugs, sometimes also called roly-polies or potato bugs. What do we call them in Ohio? Potato bugs. Great. Potato bugs. Picture a potato bug. And how when you reach out and touch a potato bug, they roll themselves into a little ball to protect themselves, right? They keep their most vulnerable parts encased in their outer shell. Reverend Christina compares those potato bugs to her old dog, Zoe. When you reach out to touch Zoe, instead of rolling up into a ball and closing herself off like a potato bug, she would unroll herself. She'd give you her belly. She'd open herself up to belly rubs and connection, and in doing so, she was exposing the softest, most vulnerable part of herself. Reverend Christina always says that her goal is to be more like Zoe and less like a potato bug. And I think that's a great goal, isn't it? Unrolling ourselves, opening ourselves up and softening into those vulnerable parts with each other, that's how we find meaningful connection in the world. And, listen, there's the hard truth that when we do so, we can risk the pain of rejection or dismissal. There's the hard truth that not everyone or every place is safe for us to share the most vulnerable parts of ourselves. Hopefully, we all can learn how to be tender places to receive each other. Softness needs to be met with softness. And there's also the hard truth that sometimes we are forced into sharing parts of ourselves when we should not have to. Sharing vulnerability is hopefully always on our own terms. But it doesn't actually happen that way, does it? These are hard truths. And yet, it is also true that the only way to deepen into our relationships with each other and with ourselves is to take a risk and let ourselves show up as the reality of who we are in this moment. Let ourselves be known in our fragile, limited, imperfect, soft, mortal glory, bit by bit. And in doing so, we give others permission to live into their vulnerability as well. In the words of Father Greg Boyle, we return ourselves to each other. We return ourselves to each other. And we return each other to ourselves. We return each other to ourselves. Father Boyle is a Jesuit priest and the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, a rehabilitation and re-entry program for gang members in Los Angeles. And he says that all of this leads to what he calls exquisite mutuality. Exquisite mutuality. When through tenderness and removing barriers, we find a sense of kinship that reminds us all of our connectedness and returns us to ourselves. You can imagine that this project of vulnerability might be a bit of a challenge when working with former gang members, like Father Boyle does. And he tells the story of this time he was invited to speak at his alma mater, Gonzaga University, and he brought with him two of his homies, which is what they lovingly call those who come through the program at Homeboy Industries. And one of them was Mario. Tall guy with a shaved head, tattoos from head to toe, tatted up even on his face, his forehead, his cheeks, his eyelids. Father Boyle describes Mario as someone who people get out of the way of when they pass by. And he also describes him as the kindest, gentlest soul at Homeboy Industries. And at one of these Gonzaga events, Mario shared his life story, full of violence and abuse and trauma and terror. He nervously and hesitantly shares his story in this big venue with about 1,000 people. And there's a question and answer time after the talk, and a woman stands up and she says she's got a question for Mario. She says, "You mentioned that you're a father. You have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What advice do you have for them?" she asks. And Mario closes his eyes, anxiously trying to come up with what to say. And suddenly he just blurts out, He's trembling, tears bubbling onto his face. "I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me," he says. There's silence in the room. The woman who asked the question stands and she's crying and she says, "Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you." And 1,000 people are on their feet clapping. As Father Boyle recalls that moment, he says, "All Mario Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And it was exquisite mutuality because all of those standing had been returned to themselves. Let us find ways to open ourselves up to these vulnerable, holy moments, dear ones. Let us follow that tender path of exquisite mutuality so that we may return each other to ourselves over and over and over again. May it be so.